Due to the themes of this podcast, listener discretion is advised. Lock your doors, close the blinds, change your passwords. This is Secrets and Spies. Secrets and Spies is a podcast that dives into the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics, and intrigue. This episode is presented by Matt Fulton and produced by Chris Carr.
Hi everyone, welcome back to Secrets and Spies. It's Matt here, although you won't be hearing much of me. We have a guest host for today's episode, which is a first for the podcast. My friend and indie spy author Stephen England, who's been on the show a couple times, will be talking with Michael Frost Beckner. Michael is a screenwriter and spy novelist, perhaps best known for his spy Game Trilogy, which was adapted into the 2001 film starring Robert Redford and Brad Pitt. He joins Stephen for a deep dive into that trilogy, his broader career as a writer, and drops some details on books still to come. I hope you'll enjoy their conversation as much as I did. Thanks for listening. A couple house cleaning notes before we get started. I want to thank all of our listeners who are currently supporting us on Patreon. If you're not currently supporting the show on Patreon, please consider doing so. It's super easy. Just go to patreon.com/Secrets and Spies. Depending on the subscription level you choose, you'll receive a set of Secrets and Spies coasters or a coffee cup. By subscribing, you'll be directly supporting this podcast, and thus we shall remain forever in your debt. Your generosity helps keep this podcast going. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get going.
The opinions expressed by guests on Secrets and Spies do not necessarily represent those of the producers and sponsors of this podcast.
Well, good afternoon, folks. This is Stephen England, and I'm joined here today on the other side of the bright lights here at Secrets and Spies by Michael Beckner. It's an honor to have you here with us today, Michael. Why don't you introduce yourself for those who might have been living under a rock and not familiar with your work?
Well, certainly. Yeah, I'm very happy to be here. I've made my career in Hollywood, actually. Spent over 30 years writing movies and television. Been very blessed to have a robust career at that. I'd started out, however, at the University of Southern California, following my lifelong passion up to that point to be a novelist. And I was fortunate to study under T.C. Boyle, a very prolific literary author. And that all went well. It got time for my thesis, and being early 20s, was faced with the prospect of being in my fraternity as the president of my fraternity and having fun my college senior year, or writing 400 pages of a novel, double-spaced, wide margins. And I thought, oh no, I don't have a book in me. So I petitioned to do a master's thesis in screenwriting. USC, which has the vaunted film school, did not at the time have a screenwriting program. They were specific to training producers and directors, but they had a master's degree in screenwriting through the journalism school, I think it was. And so there wasn't an intention to go into Hollywood at the time. It was really kind of cheating. I knew enough to know that screenplays, you get an F if it's over 120 pages, and the margins are very narrow, and it's a lot of white space on the pages is a good screenplay. So I thought I'd pulled a fast one, and so I wrote a script and got my thesis that way. And then I went into writing publicity for Walt Disney Studios. And it was the olden days where they'd send to the newspapers and whomever a publicity kit with, a typed up summary and then black and white photos from the film. My job was to write the caption under the photo. So it would be Brer Fox and Brer Bear throw Brer Rabbit into the briar patch. Copyright Walt Disney Productions, 1950, whatever. And anyway, that was my job, and I wasn't really writing a book or anything else. I was writing screenplays. I did realize that I liked it, and I was fairly good at it, and so I put the novel thing aside. And in a very odd way, I came to Barry Levinson, the director of Rain Man, and many, many other things. I came to his attention on a film called Tin Men because my other job in the still department was the 35 millimeter still film that came off the set. My job was to make sure Richard Dreyfuss's eyes were open, Danny DeVito wasn't cropped out of the picture, Barbara Hershey didn't look strange. Anyway, as a chimp could do the job, really, but I was the chimp, and so I'd send that back to the set. Well, for some reason, he really liked the photos I chose. I became his writing assistant on Good Morning Vietnam and then Rain Man. And his partner, a gentleman named Mark Johnson, knew that I had ambitions as a screenwriter. And he said, you can use all our facilities all the time, do the screenwriting thing. And all we ask is to look at whatever you write. And very encouraging. And I worked there and made my way up there. I sold a script called Sniper. They made it into a film with Tom Berenger and Billy Zane. I think they just released the 10th one a few weeks ago. They keep making these movies, which is it's wonderful. Anyway, what it had been kind of funny because I'd written a bunch of more Barry Levinson-esque scripts, while I was under there. I figured, give them something like they do. And they passed, and they didn't really prefer them, and they didn't think I was doing a very good job, I think. So this one, since it was sort of brutal and about Marine snipers in Panama, I just didn't want to embarrass them and embarrass me, and so I put it aside. I was on my honeymoon, and I get a call from the studio, TriStar Pictures at the time. And they said, we just read your script and we're buying it. And what a great gift it was. I go, how did you get it? Well, Mark Johnson brought it in. And I'm like, oh, man. And so I called him. He goes, yeah, I was in your office. I was looking for some coverage and I found this script and I loved it. And we're buying it. And we're making it. So get home from your honeymoon and we're going to make the film. Anyway, that started my screenwriting career. And so I didn't really go back to the novel thing for quite a while. I got pigeonholed. It was about the time that a lot of the money from Japan and international money was coming into Hollywood, Canada, and Europe, and they were making these mini studios like Carolco Pictures and Largo and these mini majors, they called them. It was also after a writer's strike. And I hadn't been in the guild, so I wasn't in the union, so I was allowed to write. And I lucked out again. And it was in the heyday of spec scripts, original spec scripts that aren't an adaptation, aren't taken from a magazine article. And I was very fortunate to write 3 in a row, one year after the next, and broke all the records, tied records for the highest selling screenplays of all time. So suddenly, whether I'd wanted to be a novelist or anything else, I was a screenwriter. And it was the time of like Lethal Weapon and that sort of thing. And so a lot of what I was doing was action comedies, doing a lot of rewrites on those for all the studios. And I got a little offended when I think Lethal Weapon 3 or something came my way. And they said, we need you to punch up the action here. And I looked at it and I'm like, this thing's wall-to-wall action. That's not the problem with this at all. The problem here is there's no relationship to reality of how human beings are. This is just wacky nonsense and it doesn't make sense. Nothing anyone's saying makes sense in conversation. So I said, you need a character rewrite. And they said, you're the action guy. Do not touch the characters. You don't know what you're doing. I got really offended by that. And so I said, I'm going to write a character thing. Yeah. So that led me to Spy Game. Awesome. And Spy Game had been the novel I was going to write. And I'd been working on it all these years. And I thought, you know what? I'm just going to lop off the last third of this book and write it as a spec screenplay, which I did. And that was the film that became Spy Game. because it wasn't an action movie, Warner Brothers wanted to buy it and wanted me to make it, all about ticking clocks and running and jumping with guns. And I passed on that. And then Beacon Pictures took it. And they didn't have a lot of money. They weren't a distributor, but they said, we're going to make your film. And so the only thing I asked for, I said, well, you can make the film of this script, and that's it. I keep the characters, I keep the world, I keep the rest of. They didn't want to buy the manuscript, and they just wanted the script. So that was the deal, and so that allowed me, in my own teeny tiny itsy bitsy George Lucasy way, to keep all the rights.
Yeah.
And then it went from there, and then. I just took those when I got with my career in film, where I was fairly kind of done with it. I moved into television, and that's a lot. In film, it's sort of fire and forget. You're the writer. If you do a good job, your job's done before camera rolls. In TV, you do all of it. You hire the actors, you hire the director each week, you run the writer's room, and I did that for 10 years on various shows. My own show, The Agency, at CBS was sort of the high point of it. Although I did.
Yes, which I've got a question or two here to ask you about that as we get into talking about the books. But yeah,
yeah. So at the end, that's what it did. Around COVID, or maybe the year before, I took out the Spy Game manuscript. That first part was Muir's Gambit. So I wrote that. Yes. Then I jumped over and wrote Bishop's Endgame and Aiken and Check. Following
okay.
And another book at the same time called Berlin Mesa, and that's kind of where you meet me now.
Yeah. So yeah, that's an interesting history. Obviously, Spy Game has long been a classic of the genre. It's one of my favorite spy films, and I think that's true for a lot of other spy fans. Charles Beaumont, in his Spybrary interview just the other day, mentioned it as one of his favorite spy films. So yeah, it's.
That was very kind to hear that. I was quite humbled to hear that from him. His book was amazing. It really meant a lot to hear that.
Yeah. So to talk about your books that kind of broaden out the Spy Game universe, I was very interested when I first picked them up, because naturally I had a lot of memories of the film, and I was thinking that it probably would be focusing on the viewpoints of either Nathan Murr or Tom Bishop or something like that. And I started reading into it. I'm like, wait, Aiken, who's Aiken? And so I'd be interested in you talking a bit about your choice of Aiken as the narrator, because in a lot of ways he's not so much a traditional spy novel protagonist. I think a lot of authors would have gone for a Nathan Murr or a Tom Bishop as kind of the central storyteller, but you focused on Russell Aiken, who he's played by Todd Boyce in the film. It's a very, very small part. But he really comes into his own in these books. So why don't you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. Okay. So with that script, because that first part of the manuscript was never included in the script, it didn't make sense to give Aiken the role that he'd had in Muir's Gambit in the film. That was an easy thing to cut out of the film. And also it gave me, I also did it because I wanted to preserve that. I didn't want to give that away at all, or give anything away. The reason I chose to focus that the books on Russell Aiken is because, with Spy Game, and it was like my conversation with Lorenzo de Bonaventura at Warner Brothers back in the day. I did not want this to be a classic spy running and jumping, save the world thing. My interest really lay in at the time and lies in the human condition of spies and spying. And we can go into that. My relationship with them, and I've had a long relationship with a number of people that have worked in that field. Muir being based on someone I knew since my childhood. He's based on a lot of things, but the one main guy. I wanted to take it from a different point of view, looking at espionage. If we're getting rid of the cut the red wire or the blue wire, or each book you got to save the world. There's a lot better authors that write that a lot better than I do. In my literary career, I'm much more interested in the human condition, and espionage has a real nice entry into that, because the human condition of trying to meet a moral stance and find a moral place within what you do and within yourself. The quest for meaning and the divine, not necessarily a named God or a Christian God or any other religion God, but the divine in life. That's kind of what I'm interested in. Espionage is nice because the boundaries are so blurred. They're
Yes.
entirely blurred. You're sanctioned to do things that are legal for your country, but are certainly absolutely illegal everywhere else. And just because your country says so gives you the right is kind of interesting and gives you the justification and the morality. We see take a James Bond, they're running around, they get their orders from headquarters, and they go run around the world doing all these things, breaking all sorts of international law, and they do it and they save the world, and that's terrific. But there certainly has to be laws that guide them within their own thing. And that's where I came to Russell Aiken. And I always found it fascinating talking with the people that I knew in that business of how an operation is planned, what parameters it has within our own government, working with the CIA, and what legal hurdles it has and everything else, and how that's subverted or stuck to. And you can do this and you can't do that. I thought he was kind of a nice perspective we hadn't seen before. Who's the damn lawyer who papers these deals? Who's the guy that's doing it, and what is that doing to him? And so that's why I wanted to take that. Also, it gives a nice balance then between Muir and Bishop, and we can see them doing their thing. Aiken's kind of holding judgment on them, and he has his own personal hangups about the two men that the book explores. But he's also entirely wrapped up in why they're doing what they're doing and what they're doing. He certainly can't just wipe his hands and say, oh yeah, I don't approve of that, or they didn't follow those rules. And he's part of it. He's part of it. I found that interesting. It goes back to, I have a real, it's mentioned in Muir's Gambit, Aiken mentions it, a real fondness for Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, which is a spy novel. It's definitely about espionage during the French Revolution, British espionage, and the character of Sidney Carton, who's the drunk lawyer who ends up, becoming the hero, the hero of it. But he certainly starts as an anti-hero. And so Aiken sort of shares a little bit with him, and about personal responsibility and ultimately by the third book, is it following your heart or love of country or love, which is the question in the third book. But that's kind of the way I wanted to do it. And that way I can balance both off it. Also his own set of problems and his own way of looking at things and what he wants from Muir and Bishop and what they want to draw out of him, what they need from him, really was the last point of a pyramid that makes these things not just there's the handler and there's the asset, and they're running and jumping and running missions, which again, other people do better than I do.
And then you have Aiken, who's tasked with trying to make everything all the illegal things they do legal.
That's right. And how he lives with himself with that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really fascinating perspective in the books. There's so much about Aiken's perspective that I found myself reflecting on this as I read further into the series, thinking that in a lot of ways there's a lot of aspects of the book that, as I'm reading it, I think to myself, this shouldn't work, but it does. And I think that's a great tribute to your writing and all that you accomplish with the books, because it really does come together in a way that I described it at the end of reading the second book as a bit of a kaleidoscopic effect, which that then takes on special significance in the third book that I didn't even realize when I made those comments. But we'll let readers figure some of that out for themselves. But it's very interesting in the way that toward the end of a book, all of a sudden, it's like the kaleidoscope gets shifted, and you look back on the book like, oh, everything just took on a new light. And some of that is the circumstances themselves. Some of that is Aiken's ability to perceive them, because he goes through a lot of kind of interesting mental and even physical challenges through the series. If you'd like to talk a bit more about his state of mind, as it were.
Yeah. Okay. Well, his state of mind is quite an oddball. I think Muir says that about him when he's an oddball. He really, oh boy. Well, it is a kaleidoscope, and it does shift in that way, as life does for people all the time. He a lot of times leads with the absolute. If he says something real quick and makes a decision very fast, unlike a James Bond, who, God, that was a good quick decision. It's usually the wrong decision with him, and I think we all can live with that. We all know that those rash decisions usually lead you in the wrong way. It's a world he's living in a world where everything is about deception. Deception is how you survive, and he's trying to be honest to himself. And so that's that first shift of the kaleidoscope. Where does in a world where everyone is sanctioned to lie and is lying, where do you fit in? He's the one who writes that.
He's trying not to take the work home, as I believe puts it at one point.
Yeah, but who doesn't take their work home when they go home? I mean, who doesn't? And so he's living with that in a higher stakes environment than the rest of us. I think with the second, it's not really a spoiler because by the first few pages, but he's dealing then with a skewed perception in the second book from a medical condition. And that then puts so we've dealt with in the first book, if you live a life of lies, what is really your truth? And he's struggling with that through that first one. And he's he's kind of a whiner in that first book because he's like, why are you guys always lying to me? Yeah. But he realizes that's the world they work in. And dude, you're doing it you're doing it yourself. You're doing it with your wife. You're doing it with the people you love. And you gotta get right with that. Well, the second one then deals with identity. And he has a medical condition where his own perception of reality and identity becomes a little confused. And so that shifts that lens again, that we look at his view. He always grows through it, but he's always thinking everyone else has got all the problems and he's just trying to patch holes in the boat. It's looking at all these other people's struggles with identity. If you live a false identity, and that's your job as a spy, you're presenting yourself as a false identity. But if you're living that, say, 23/7, that's your identity. And isn't that as real and defining of who you are as a man or a woman? And so all the characters deal with that as he's narrating it, looking at it, and trying to see this struggle for identity. And it reflects back on him. And his own identity is crumbling because of a medical condition. He's actually losing his own identity. By the third book, it takes the idea of false reality and the life of lies of the first book. The second book, false identity and appearance is reality, because you're setting that up. And then looks at, okay, that's how you relate. Your job is about information. Then it looks at, in the third book, this theft of information, stealing information, trying to get information, but in information physics. And the third book goes into the Office of Technical Services and how, you don't just get given the keys to the car that have the defibrillator because, oh my gosh, you're going to get poison on your hand and have a heart attack, but you got a defibrillator in your car. That's not how it works. Really, when they need something operational for the field, it goes through, you got to identify what that need is going to be and what you're looking at, what you want to spy on. Then what do you want? You got to give that to the people in the scientific department. What's the magic wand you need? And they got to figure out a way to make that magic wand. And then what is it? So that's where the third book goes. But what we realize, and what is, I think, is a truth, is the way you get information and take information and process information is marred and impacted by your perspectives, your identity, what you are. The person receiving information colors that information immediately once he touches it with his own place. So in the third one, Aiken's perception again changes, and so in the third one, his medical condition has changed it organically from what happened to him before, and it gives him another perspective on sort of his reality and the theft of information and how they're stealing secrets. And that's for Aiken. Muir and Bishop really need to be the spies that we follow to do the spy story stuff. Aiken's not, Aiken gets dragged into it each time. I think that's a little bit where some of the humor in the book comes through.
Partly because he always wanted to be Bishop. I mean, he started out wanting to be the guy in the field, and then he gets pigeonholed off to the office of general counsel. And yeah,
and I think with Aiken, I think we can all relate to that. We all wish we were the hero in our own stories, and it takes us a long time to realize that we really are the hero of the story. We just our heroism and the things that we do heroically are small victories. We're not going to be Bishop, but Bishop is the person that relies on us. The bishops in our life, they always rely on us, and that's kind of what Aiken. That's what Muir and Bishop are driving Aiken towards. Accept who you are, because you're our hero. You're the guy that keeps it all together. We can't do it. We need you. And boy, but he fights against that throughout. And and that makes the books. That makes the drama. I was going to say another thing about Aiken. The other thing that I did, which is different from screenwriting, obviously it's all prose. The movie plays in your head. It's not going to have actors interpret it and that sort of thing. But it's also, Aiken is telling these stories in first person, and they're all documents. And one of the thing with Aiken, because he really is in three ways is losing his mind throughout this. The documents themselves, he's trying to protect himself with how he's writing them, especially in the third book, which is a confession. He doesn't want that confession to get to the CIA and them to think he's selling them out. He's thinking, if this all goes wrong, so that book is embedded with codes. Most of my time was spent, I don't know anything about I don't do crossword puzzles. I'm glad in the airplane when they're already half filled out. But he does. He's obsessed with puzzles and codes. I spent so much time learning about codes and symbolism and how to do that, because he writes these in there. He has so many peculiarities of language, so that there'll be a place, if you read in the book, you'll go, why did Beckner choose that word? There's a weird, and you look it up and you go, oh, that's the word. That does mean what it is, but God, he could have told that much more easily. Well, it's most likely because Aiken, in the writing it, and I had to do it, and it was very difficult work, has that word. Maybe it starts with a K and ends with a V. Well, that means he's been writing no Ks or Vs until that moment that they made in the alphabet. There are so many. So that's part of the thing as well. Aiken is also, there's a subtext to these books that he is writing a code. The second book, there's a crossword puzzle he keeps talking about. The very first one, all the clues of that crossword puzzle are built into the object that he gets the object in there. You can do that crossword puzzle if you figure out the math of the little
Wow.
of the thing. So I really wanted to get his voice down, and in getting his voice, I had to create these things. When he's nervous, he'll write in palindromes. I don't know if anyone's ever noticed that, but he goes on and on with those. And that was just, I was tired of writing interior, exterior, clump of dialogue, get them across the set, clump of dialogue. And so that was kind of the joy of writing these books, was also going kind of full meta with them and making Aiken be the voice of the books. It's much easier now with the new trilogy, which is Muir.
Very interesting.
Which I don't have to do any of that crap. He's very straightforward, and his voice is much easier to write.
Yeah, that gets to a question I was going to ask you later, which was on further plans for the broader spy game universe. But I wanted to ask as well about the influence. Murr is in his official or public role. He's a philosophy professor at Princeton, and I wondered if you'd be interested in talking a bit about that and a bit about the influences of philosophy on the series, because it's another one of those things that kind of permeates your writing. I mean, Murr's code name is Prometheus, after the Greek legend of the man who stole fire from the gods. And be interested in hearing your perspective on that aspect of Murr's personality.
Yeah, Muir is a professor, and you don't get much of it. You don't get that in the film, except that he's wearing kind of professorial clothes, the houndstooth with the elbow patches, and he looks like a lot of my professors. The yeah, his job when he's not running operations is recruiting, and he teaches philosophy and mythology. Part of it is because that's what my other degree was in. I got a master's in screenwriting and an undergraduate degree in philosophy. So I'm fascinated by it. I think when you're dealing in this gray world of espionage and what they're tasked to do, and a lot of times they're also, spies aren't tasked to save the entire world. They're tasked one piece of a larger puzzle, and they many times don't know what that is. I think for Muir, having that more philosophical bent allows him to do what he has to do. Muir does some horrible things. I mean, maybe they move policy very well, but he's the guy that has to do the bad shit.
Right.
And so he is dedicated. His mind is dedicated to really the philosophy and the ethics behind these things and why we do what we do and what the meaning is. Deception and reality, and you can go, I don't think we talk about it in the books, but Plato's cave, and we're seeing images projected behind us. Well, isn't that metaphorical for sort of the spy game? We're seeing shadows, but we don't actually know what's casting the shadow behind us, and it's Muir's job to turn around and find out what the hell's casting that shadow. So it seems that espionage and philosophy do pair up fairly nicely. Mythology as well, because everything, people behave in narrative forms from the very earliest way the mind works in recognizing patterns to creating stories. We're a species that's story based. And so again, in espionage, you're not trying to find the body and prove the murder. So you don't got that to make it easier for you. You're looking at something much more esoteric. You're looking at intelligence, trying to find someone else's intention. So what you're trying to do is piece together a story. And mythologies are all the basic building blocks of storytelling. So Muir is an expert at mythology because he needs to figure out, what is the story that I'm jumping into the middle of when I steal this piece of information, when we have this political crisis in Cyprus what is the story that they're operating on? Why you have the Cypriot Greeks and the Turks. What are they battling at? It gets back to basic stories of their fundamental societies. And so Muir finds a deep resonance with philosophy and mythology. Aiken studying law, a lot of good undergraduate law students study philosophy. And so he got to it not because he sees himself as some kind of philosopher. It's good for building logical arguments. Studying philosophy, you study a lot of logic. Mm-hmm. And that's where his thing, and that's where he and Muir crossed earlier when he was a pre-law student and had to take philosophy courses.
Yeah, and was recruited as showing a Doctor Strangelove, which is one of my favorite films of that era. So I enjoyed that detail.
Oh, good, good. Yeah, I've collected a lot of very strange recruitment stories from people in who have worked with the CIA and some other things. People get recruited in strange ways to do strange jobs. Um, it wasn't till I was never recruited because I didn't sign anything, but I did spend a lot of time working. I realized looking back, well, dude, if you're going back and forth to Langley, this is in the '90s, once or twice a month to talk to people who are real interested in Hollywood and movie thing, they aren't that interested really. They're interested in you doing something for them. And it took me a while to realize I thought I was really clever and I'd gotten my way in the door. Um, yeah, Michael Beckner didn't pick the lock to the CIA. They got me in there, and I met a lot of wonderful people. I have a lot of lifelong friends that have informed a lot of what I've written in my books. But it is the stories they tell in Mirror's Gambit. I embellish it a bit, but really the story with the claustrophobia of Russell
Yeah.
Aiken and that thing, I got that, and then one that was the same story, but it had to do with a phobia of spiders that an officer had been put through. They put him through the ringer with their own phobias, and I thought that was really quite interesting, and it made its way into the book.
Yeah, yeah. Thinking further along the philosophy mythology bit, as we're talking about it, I'm thinking that I think one of the things that's kind of drawn me to your work since Spy Game, and it's true of this trilogy as of books as well. Uh, but I think you capture very well the sense of the tragic in the spy business in a way that I think a lot of the more pop culture presentations of the spy game, as it were, don't really touch on. I mean, you have that moment in Spy Game where in Lebanon where the doctor goes in to treat the militia leader, and little does anyone know, particularly Bishop, that it's going to coincide. That doctor's visit is going to coincide with a Christian Lebanese militia deciding to simply blow up the doctor with a car bomb, and there's an interesting sense of the unintentional tragic in a lot of what you portray that I think does reflect real life quite well, but it also kind of harkens back to those Greek tragedies and how they would unfold. What your thoughts on that?
Yeah, life is about avoiding those unavoidable things, and we never do. I think in the business these characters are in, you're confronted with larger tragedies every day. There's also a part in I think yours telling Aiken about unintended consequences, something about what he gets a guy to kill himself.
Mm,
And it's basically, he says to Aiken, he says, you just wouldn't be good at this because you don't think to the thing of, by doing that, I may be screwing up 1,000 other lives that are innocent, that aren't even attached to this operation.
yes.
And in the field, you got to be the guy that says, I'm okay with that. Um, and so that's sort of the sense of it all repercusses off, everything has cause and effect. And I've known a number of officers that couldn't deal with that. And
Yeah.
it's funny. Redford didn't want to do, oh, those were real marriages. He threw in the thing at the very end. Oh, let's say they're cover wives. A lot of people, it's not cover wives. They
Yeah.
can't keep their relationships. The alcoholism in it is, I've met a lot of recovered alcoholics who and a lot of alcoholics who work in that business. You're dealing with tragic circumstances. I remember an officer telling me um, that one thing that really affected them was they were moving back to Langley. Their tour was done, and they're getting on an airplane. They were called. They said, "Don't get on that plane. Why? We think that plane is going to have a terrorist event." Oh, are we doing anything about it? No, we're not. And it didn't. No one died. The plane didn't blow up. But she said, the worst thing is thinking I can't tell anyone. I can't tell anyone, and I'm not going to take the plane. I'm not stupid.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
and that's the kind of thing that you take home at night, and that's the kind of thing that eats at you. That's the kind of thing that why Aiken couldn't, he gets in the field a couple times and does a bang up job, but why he couldn't do it all the time. He's too sensitive. And a lot of spies portrayed in really popular genre fiction, they are prided on not being sensitive at all, and they can deal with it. I'm not. I wrote that in movies and a lot of rewrites for a lot of films, where that's the heroic guy, and that's fun, and we like that in our movies. We like that kind of hero, but these heroes are more tapped into that sense of the tragic, and God, the mission today that's really the good mission. Bishop deals with it the best because he doesn't dwell on it. He assassinates against spy game, and it opens in that Vietnam scene. That assassination he does is the sniper sequence.
Right.
That ripples back over and over in the stories in the Muir trilogy, which I'm writing now, and that goes the first book anyway. That goes back to sort of the minute Muir leaves Langley at the end of Spy Game, and then covers the next 10 years. I gave myself some space there.
So kind of the space between the movie and Bishop's Endgame.
That's right, in that space.
Yeah,
and
nice.
and like these books do, they fold back to past events. So it's what was Muir doing the rest of the time in Vietnam and in that period.
Excellent.
And that goes back to the guy who I based the basic framework of Muir on. That's what he was doing with the CIA in Laos and that sort of thing. And I'll touch on that in the book. But that event for Bishop in the Spy Game, ripples and what it was really about and what it really caused and what happened. And the books go into that in Aiken and Check and Muir's Gambit and Bishop's Endgame. Bishop lives with it because you know what? The set of orders I got and what it was about at the time and what I was told, that's what I did. And I can live with that. Okay, it was about something else. It meant something. It's not my business. That's who I am. And Bishop is more of that and always remains more of that sort of James Bond character who's able to just do it, not worry about it. You know what? If it was about something else, no one told me. I'm not going to lose sleep over it.
He can compartmentalize much better than Aiken.
Much better, and that's why Muir put him in the field because you need to be able to do that.
There's a great quote in one of the books. I can't recall exactly which one it is now, but there's a great quote from Aiken. He says, "Good intentions have led to more disasters in my life than I care to count." And I think there's I think that's another aspect that's not always touched upon in the genre a lot, is that something terrible happening does not actually have to be a deliberate choice by some villain. Sometimes it's just people groping in the dark, trying to do their best, and partly succeeding or sometimes failing utterly.
Yeah, and that's what I write too. That said it very well, and because it's they were sitting me down once, and they were talking about how they recruit. I don't know if they were kind of pitching me, but they basically said, we only hire patriots, and we're doing patriotic stuff. We hire the best of the best good people. And that's why they always liked my work at Langley, is because my characters, they're not bad guys. No. They just maybe make some bad choices and see things a little bit different than what the greater good might be, or the greater good for us is not a greater good for someone else. And they don't, and so it's not that. So you slip into the gray and you slip. They talked about the sliding scale of, and I go into it in Muir's Gambit, of we recruit white hats. There's these guys, the people we recruit are all wearing white hats. We make sure they're white hatted, and we don't put them in places where they're going to be doing black deeds. That's not what we do. But what happens is, as you get better at it, you get more challenging assignments and operations, you step into the gray. And you have to know that when you go home, you put the white hat back on. But occasionally people go into the gray, and then that gray becomes white. And then so the middle that was gray has slid right down into a bit of black. And that's now the middle ground. And you have to watch yourself to never let that sliding scale be all black, but you're looking at, your end is black, but you're calling it white. And that's how people get corrupted in it and go astray and do bad things. But no one's intending to take over. There's no Dr. Evils. It's just people. Their intentions are maybe, there's a little more greed than they want to admit. There's more, and it's then the moral and the philosophical that you have to wrestle with. At all levels.
Yeah, as I think most of us know from our day-to-day lives, it's always easy to find someone you can point to and say, "Well, I'm not as bad as that person."
Exactly. Isn't that the truth? And so it's a nice canvas to paint on in the world of espionage, because there's so much latitude to find moments like that. The guys, Harker and the characters on the 7th floor, they're not buffoons.
No.
I catch them on the day they're acting like idiots. But they wouldn't have that job if they weren't qualified for the job. But people sometimes make mistakes and act like idiots. And so I try and have sympathy for all the characters as well, even the characters that are truly villains in the story, in the stories. You got to give them some sympathy, because they're not. No one sets out to be an arch villain. In the data, I guess some people do, but that's, then you got 10 stories. And, if you want to keep writing stories, you got to find the person that didn't set out to be the arch villain, and the person that didn't set out, that's comfortable with not saving the world every time they go to work. You're just saving a little bit of it.
Yeah, for sure. I was very interested as I was thinking back. I rewatched Spy Game after finishing Mur's Gambit, and I was interested thinking about it in the context of these books, because you have the film Spy Game comes out in the tail end of 2001. Another big espionage film that came out just, I think, slightly less than a year later, was the adaptation of The Bourne Identity. And it was interesting as I thought about it. I'd actually rewatched that film with my wife not too many months ago. And as I was thinking about it, I was struck by the fact that both of those stories at their core are Vietnam War stories. But when The Bourne Identity was brought to film, that was all stripped away. It was modernized. It was brought into the present day, as it were, which was not at all what you did with Spy Game. And I'm kind of curious, because there's a lot of emphasis in our genre on kind of writing ripped from the headlines stories that are kind of what's coming next, as it were. And you've done a fair bit of that as well. We can talk about your work with the agency, with that TV series, but with the film Spy Game, and then with this trilogy of books that surrounds it, you're writing more period pieces. And I'd be interested if you share your thoughts on kind of the differences between writing those two styles, those two approaches to this genre.
Yeah, the Spy Game wasn't intended as a period piece, because it took, let's see, how many years? 5 years to 5 or 6 years to get made. When I'd originally done it, the intention was Paul Newman and Robert Redford, and which it would have been great, would have been fabulous. And Paul Newman got Robert Redford and then backed out, said, "I'm not doing this. I'm way too old for this." And he said, "I'd rather see Bob do the Muir role than the Bishop role." If it had happened that way, the books wouldn't work at all. So I'm perfectly happy that it didn't happen that way. But that shows you it was a number of years before the film was made. What
Gotcha.
Tony did was, he said, because the studio, Universal, was distributing it, they weren't involved in the development until the very end. They became the distributor with Beacon, and they had their say on a number of things. And they really wanted it. Okay, let's move it out of Vietnam and update it. And Tony Scott said, "No, the script is this way, and I get this, and I'm doing Beckner's script." And so it stayed that way. The agency, I wrote a lot of contemporary stuff, and even back to Sniper, TriStar Pictures held it up because they said, we don't have Marines in Panama. We don't have what's going on here. And I said, just, give it 8 months and we're going to invade Panama. What are you talking about? I've always been real good at looking at the trends. I didn't want to do that because then too much of your time is spent on the politics of a situation and trying to ride that crest of the wave. And I'm more comfortable doing that in television and film where there's an immediacy to it. In writing a book, I really would rather it sit in a world where we kind of know where the world went. We kind of know the events. I like to dig out secrets of past events we don't know and put those in my books.
That becomes particularly fascinating in Bishop's Endgame, but I don't want to spoil that story for readers. But
some weird things came together with that. That was very odd. That's why I put the acknowledgments at front, because it was such an odd thing that came together that made that story coalesce, and then tying the time period, and that takes place in May of 2001. That did work out, but again, it doesn't really go about what happens in September. It doesn't really go there. It just has that as a backdrop. I want to avoid the where was I that day, that happened kind of stuff. Yeah. And I want to really talk, look at characters dealing with something that we have some context too. We have some context and see how did these people deal with that and the moral questions they were confronted with and the ethical questions and life in that thing. So that's why I kind of, with the books, I give nice slices of Muir's Gambit has a lot of Cold War stuff. I think people get to go, wow, I didn't really know that was happening then, and does that. But it's more to let the characters breathe and get to know these people. And for Aiken and Muir, their own interpersonal relationships with their wives are, I think much more dramatic than saving the world and stuff. And I think that my readers, I'm writing to people that really want to reflect about, we all have interpersonal relationships and maybe get some back and forth metaphorically with my books on how we deal with interpersonal relationships and that sort of thing. I'm interested in that.
Yeah, I thought it was very fascinating how you handled all that in Bishop's Endgame. It's probably my favorite book of the series, though. I enjoyed them all, but that one was particularly striking as you think of the time in which it's set and everything else that was going on, plus all the history that you wove into it. It was quite good.
It is the good pivot point in the series, because I've set up a set of rules of how the books are going to be with Muir's Gambit. And so much of that, I mean, that's a debriefing in a sense. So there's not any present action, really. There's a murder investigation or a couple murder investigations for present action, but that's the debriefing. Then you get the spy story with Bishop's Endgame, but you get it through my storytelling lens. And I'm able to do what I want to do while giving readers that, the spy story, the Bishop spy story that people love, and I love those as well. That's the one that would make the best movie, I imagine. And then with Aiken and Czech, I've earned the right to go really a little bit more deeper into what I really like, and physics and philosophy and deep character, and the absurdism. I find a lot of what I've dealt with in my intersection with espionage. There's a strange absurdity to it. So kind of
that's another thing I wanted to touch on. I noticed recently that Aiken and Czech was ranking quite highly on the rankings of Amazon for absurdist fiction, and I was struck that you had categorized it that way, and yet I think it makes sense because there is an absurdity to this business that you capture well.
Yeah, well, what's kind of funny is in choosing those rankings, that was the third or fifth. I think there was 10, and that was way down the list. I tried to sell that book as straight espionage, international mystery, all those things. But I guess however Amazon works, they found that, and I did down the way down on the thing, put absurdism, because it is it's more a Kurt Vonnegut book than I think a Le Carre type book or a Ian Fleming. It's more that.
Yeah, that's an interesting comparison. I can see that.
That's just how the algorithm there has worked out. But now I look at it and it's like, well, why can't it be ranked in espionage at all? It's not now. It's movie tie-in. I get that they rank. These are based on a movie and movie characters. That works. But then it's two categories of absurdism, which I think is, well, it's absurd. I think it should be considered an espionage book, but
yeah, for
but
sure.
it's selling well. I'm very happy with that book. That book is really took the most effort and took the most thought and has the most thought in it. But again, it is the third book of a trilogy. If you haven't read the first two, I think it's probably not something to just pick up and read. It's pretty weighty.
For sure, yeah. Thinking back to we've touched on your involvement with your show, The Agency, and thinking of Bishop's Endgame and the historical period it's set in, I was highly entertained that TV show actually comes up in the book, and I two things about that. First of all, I wonder if you'd share some of your thoughts on weaving it into the story. But I'm also very curious whether Michael Beckner might actually show up in the pages of Bishop's Endgame, perhaps with names changed to protect the guilty.
Yeah. Well, it was so outlandish. I tell you, pitching that scene in Bishop's Endgame, and it annoyed me so much I had to put it in the book. To have the president of drama at CBS say, you got this name, Bin Laden. And she kept repeating, Bin Laden. And you get what I'm doing? I'm going, no. She goes, it sounds like Aladdin. It's very silly. I'm like, well, that's a real name. That's a real guy. And then she said that, and she didn't listen to me. And then she went on, and her little assistant was like the little kangaroo in Horton Hears a Who, popping up. And she goes, and what's this Al Qaeda? This is ridiculous. You got to invent new things. And I said, well, these are real. And the president said to me, if they were real, if this was a real person and Al Qaeda was real, we would know about it because we have a news division down the hall. And I thought, I'm going to call you guys out at one point because this is the most idiotic thing ever. Yeah. So when you see at the end of that book, and Aiken, he has hypergraphia and asphyxia, and so he's putting a lot of there's a lot of diagrams and stuff in Bishop's Endgame, which is symptomatic of someone who's suffering from that. They add drawings to their writing. And so, but that invitation for the agency premiere is the invitation. I have it framed on my wall right here. I'm looking at it. And so we were going to have our premiere at CIA headquarters in the Dome. And I framed it because it says, please RSVP by September 11th, 2001. And obviously we didn't have the premiere there because that came around. Boy, maybe there I was a little bit too much on me and needed to be on something else. You don't know, but it is quite ironic in a very sad and awful way because they got busy after that day.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it made its way into the book because I was annoyed. And
yeah,
that's just the way it was.
Yeah, it was a great scene. It was one of those scenes where you read it and it's like, this is almost too absurd not to be true.
yeah, exactly. That's 30 years of Hollywood. It's absolute absurdity that working there.
Yeah. One other thing I was really interested by, I think for people who enjoyed Spy Game, one of the big moments that we all kind of remember from it is the rooftop scene where Bishop tears into Murr about, you can't trade these people like they're a deck of cards, and Murr basically tells him he's completely wrong, and it's a fantastic scene between those two actors. What I found kind of interesting was then in the trilogy, there's a great scene between Nathan Murr and Silas Kingston, who's the leader, as you put it, which is a great turn of phrase. He's the head of the CIA's counter intel janissaries. I love that expression. But there's a scene between the two of them where Murr harkens back to that moment from Spy Game, and he basically tells Kingston, Bishop was right. And I was interested if you could talk a little bit about that change in Murr's perspective and how he comes to see how he comes to see that so very differently.
I think it's with I don't want to give any spoilers away, but
Right, for sure.
that scene happens in Aiken and Check. Aiken, what I do with each book is each book goes back to that day at the CIA where Bishop is captured in China and what leads up to that and what's really going on there. It makes it. I did that because it's fun. It's fun to. I think it's fun after you finish each book. Go, oh shoot! Well, that's what was going on when they were talking about that, or that's who that guy in that scene was, and you get to see a totally different. It's a kaleidoscope. It shifts
exactly,
and then the movie changes again.
Yeah,
and it's nice. I can sell repeat viewers of Spy Game and get my residual up every time. But so that happens right after. Silas Kingston is one of those guys in the credits because they changed it up. They call in the credits it's Dr. Byers or something. That wasn't in the script. It was Silas Kingston, but they made it something else because they didn't follow that storyline. There were a few more lines in the script that just didn't make it.
I think Aiken's first name is Robert in the credits or something like that. It's
yeah, but that wasn't what it was.
Yeah,
I don't know why they changed that. I have no idea. They didn't like Russ. Someone didn't like the name Russell. They took away he had in the script. He had maybe had one half scene with Muir that made you understand that they worked together. I get taking it out of the movie. There were no books. The book wasn't published, so get rid of it. But with Kingston, Muir has to go through that day and has to make the decision to save Bishop. And it wouldn't work in the movie because we don't have any of the threads because it was a longer story. They left out of them. The only thing I wanted them to put in, and that Tony said we just don't have the time, is there's a confrontation from before Bishop's captured between Bishop and Muir over that burned flag we've seen in his office in the film, where Bishop tells him, if I find out that you were behind Catherine being kidnapped, I'm going to kill you. And Muir knows, I've trained this guy so well, he'll do it. He'll do it. He won't think twice about it. And so that when we watch the film, that is what the Redford character is actually dealing with. If I go through with this, there's a good chance I'm a dead man. And I think that would have, and so later when he is dealing with Silas Kingston in the third book, he is dealing with that resonating with him as well. And he's having to realize, I did this to this guy. I did all of this to Bishop. And you know what? He was right. In a human to human level, he's totally right. I'm moving policy forward. I'm moving my operations forward, but I am using him as a trading card more than, I used him as a card. It's not that we used, the German as the trade playing card. Yeah, I made you do that, but I've used you. And so he has to admit to Kingston, you know what, that he's right. I'm wrong. And I can live with it now. I'm leaving the CIA and I can live with this.
Yeah, I do find it I've found it very fascinating watching the film after reading Murr's Gambit and further looking back on watching the film after reading the successive 2 books of the series. They definitely completely transform how you view what happens in those scenes. It's quite fascinating.
Yeah, that was fun. I don't think in the new trilogy I'll be able to pivot off that event that much because I've said sort of everything I need to say, but I have new events. But I'm moving a little bit off the film, obviously.
Yeah. So tell us a bit about your plans for this new trilogy of books. I'm very fascinated to see where you'll go with those.
Well, what I found most interesting is, so this trilogy is 3 Muir books. And so it's going to be first person as the Aiken books.
Okay.
And it's Muir. It did take me a while to get into it because I realized that, as we all do, we have our outer persona and the way we speak and the way we display our lives. And I realized, and I tried to write Muir the way he is and behaves with people, his narration. I realized that's not really him. He's sort of like me and probably everyone else. There's an internal thing going on that's not, we don't share that. And so we're getting a much more internal picture of Muir, you think you know Muir because, hey, he did that whole book, Muir's Gambit, and confessed everything to Aiken. I got him nailed down. You don't know him at all. And he's a much more complicated person. And then he's dealing with, he's devoted his life. This is before he gets to doing recruitment and working as as an annuitant. That we see him at Bishop's Endgame. This is he's on the run. And by the way, he really screwed things up for the CIA and the US government. So he's not anyone's favorite person. So he's got that to deal with. So it is much more, there's a lot more genre element in that part of it.
Okay.
But he's also reflecting back to before he met or recruited Bishop in Vietnam and dealing with that. The guy who formed that part of Muir in real life worked on something called Operation Popeye, which was cloud seeding in Vietnam over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And we had the clever idea of we'll just drown their food supply out. And so that is the shell operation that he's operating under. So it's very early, it's early 65, I guess 65 to 68 in Vietnam and Laos. Mostly it goes Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The third book will get to after the war and the killing fields in Cambodia. At the same time, dealing with really much more of a sort of LA noir-ish, but set in the 90s, with Muir dealing with sort of the repercussions of what he's just done in the film. So it would be, in that sense, that part of the book is basically would be the sequel to Spy Game. If we followed Muir in that car out of the CIA, this is what happens. So that's kind of what that part is. Yeah. It's a lot of fun. It's tough. I'm also doing, I'm taking the Kaleidoscope operation that really comes out in Aiken and Czech and Silas Kingston, and writing a set of serial books, short novellas. I'm going to do 6 over the next maybe 9 months and release those that follow Lynn Kingston, Silas Kingston, and that family. And they're basically serials, kind of like what Stephen King did, 20, 30 years ago with The Green Mile, where just these short books I'm going to release that follow that. And that, I would describe that as sort of the Sopranos set in the CIA, if you would. It's that family, but a saga, a family saga. And that's fun to write because it's not as difficult as the Muir book, which is taking a lot of thought.
Yeah. So I have to ask, if there's a trilogy from Aiken's perspective and a trilogy from Muir's perspective, will there be a trilogy from Bishop's perspective?
Granted, I lived that long. That would be wonderful. It's a lot of work. I don't have much more to do. I have a lot of kids. COVID, most of my kids are grown up, but COVID brought us a surprise. So I'm still doing the daddy stuff. I've been doing it my whole life. I'm 60 now, and I seem to always have a little kid in the house. That distracts from writing. Otherwise, yes, there will. I think he's the hardest character. He's going to be the hardest character to get under the skin of.
Interesting.
Because it's just not going to be fair to people that read my books to just do an action book, which would be very easy to do with Bishop. That'd be the kind of thing I do when I write movies. I'm not writing books to do what I did there. So it's gonna be figuring out what exactly do I want to say about the human condition through a guy like Bishop, and that would probably take place in that period of time between Spy Game, the film, and Bishop's Endgame, and then afterwards, later on.
Yeah, I can
definitely
see a lot of room for that. Yeah.
Yeah, I know it's there. It's what happened is the Muir trilogy, even though I think it won't, I know when I get to the end, it'll inform that book. So I gotta write those to know what I'm writing next.
For sure, yeah. I am interested, thinking of the gap between when you first conceived of Spy Game, when you first conceived of Muir's Gambit, and then the film, and then now all these years later, actually bringing the trilogy to its conclusion. How difficult was it for you to kind of go back and build from that foundation all these years after you'd written the start of it?
Well, the Bishop's Endgame, that I kept putting notes when I was
Okay.
working on my series, The Agency, and then I spent probably the best working relationship of my life. Although we didn't make any films, I worked on some of his, but I worked with Sidney Pollack, and
Mm.
I worked a long time with him doing writing work for him. And we'd developed an idea that was similar to Bishop's Endgame. He was a big fan of Spy Game. He wanted to make his Spy Game, which would be the next film, and we never did. So I had a lot of notes from that. So Bishop's Endgame, I was able to do through just a lot of stories and notes I collected. I meet and worked with so many CIA officers that would give me tidbits of things. They all went in the drawer. So that worked out. Aiken and Czech, I was then left on my own. And I did have one the mirror my mirror inspiration didn't have anything, but I had a couple people that knew a lot about espionage against Cuba and Venezuela. And so I was able to draw from them and make that go that way. And I'd worked a lot with I was very close friends with Tony Mendez and Jana Mendez. We would spend some holidays every 4th of July we'd spend together, and he taught me quite a bit. I worked with him for a while. And so I
There.
always wanted to do an OTS book.
Yeah.
So that's why, although the first book I dedicated to him, the third book really got into some of the people that I'd meet through that social circle of their friends that they worked with, who I'd end up meeting with in social ways, and a lot of times meeting socially with in a kind of secure place where everyone's sort of in the know. You get a lot of information. There's freedom, a little bit more freedom to speak, rather than meeting someone on an airplane
Yeah.
and they're not going to tell you jack shit. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating. Is there anything we haven't covered that you'd like to discuss?
Yeah, I think we really got a good thing. It's nice to talk about it. Was preparing for this. I'd never really thought about any of these questions. I just write. I do what I've always done. So it was very nice to really organize my thoughts on what the heck am I trying to do, and that's where I got to realizing, that's why Aiken and Czech ends up in the absurdist fiction column and
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
suspense espionage. It is. I write a different beast. I write from the point of view and people that want to. I've had a lot of access and I don't have any security clearance. People have asked me, how were you able to get this past the review board? I go, I don't have to give anything to any review board. I didn't sign the paper.
Yeah.
They asked me to, but they said you would have to, then you couldn't take another salary from Hollywood. We would be paying your salary. And I'm like, no, I got 6 kids. I got to get my Hollywood and I have 2 divorces. I need to make the Hollywood money, not the government the government check.
stipend.
I'm happy to help. I'm happy to help, but I need to be a volunteer.
Yeah.
But so really that is that's my perspective, and I've been very blessed to work with a lot of real heroic American patriots and people from other countries around the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you've created a fascinating trilogy, and one that really reframes not only each successive book reframes the previous one, but that really reframes what's a classic of the genre in spy games. So, yeah, I was thrilled to dig into it and enjoyed every minute I spent in the world. Can't wait to see what comes when we finally get inside the head of Nathan Murr.
Yeah, well, I'm
Yeah.
feeling the same way as you. There's some places he's popped up and he said, you were thinking that? My goodness, that takes me in a different direction. But that's the joy of writing, as you would know as an author. Sometimes your
Yes.
characters take you places you didn't expect, and you're better off for it.
Isn't that the truth? Yeah. Well, so one last question before we go then. Where can people go to learn more about you and your work?
I have my website, michaelfrostbeckner.com, and all my books are there. And I think I put stuff up about what I'm also working on, other things I'm working on. There's a nice bio there that covers my Hollywood career. So I have that. I have Michael Frost Beckner on Instagram and on Facebook. I didn't use Facebook for years until I started doing this, and it's quite. I met you. We've had
Yes,
made a
indeed.
lot of friendships and a lot of interesting people. So yeah, if you search my name, all my different social media and that sort of thing. I independently publish, and that was a choice I made. I have a good literary agent, but the publishers really like Hollywood, really wanted me to write different kinds of books, more like my movies, more like
Yeah.
in some of my other stuff, and that I didn't want to do. So you're going to find me most easily on BarnesandNoble.com, Amazon, obviously,
Yeah.
and the other thing, but that's where I'm doing it, and I'm enjoying it. Oh, and the last thing I needed to say is we just finished our writer's strike, and I have Beacon Pictures, who did the original Spy game. They share rights with me on the film. Universal discovered that they don't have the rights. They have the right to shoot the script, just shoot that script again. That's the only right they have. They thought they had more rights. They don't. Beacon and I share them. And we do have interest in the television series, streaming series, and in more than interest, because I just turned in the pilot script for Mirror's Endgame.
Oh,
So
wonderful.
Universal is shopping that now clandestinely to the platforms to see who'd like to take that. Universal realized we can't give up. We're not going to give away Spy Game, even though we don't want it. We certainly don't want Beckner and Beacon Pictures to run away with it. So we partnered with them, and
Okay.
yeah, we'll see. Beacon and I have a good relationship, and that series is coming together. So
Excellent.
we will see if Universal can get it done.
We'll all look forward to potentially seeing these books brought to the small screen then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this has been a pleasure and honor, Michael. Thanks for coming on board Secrets and Spies to talk about your work.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really, really quite enjoyable. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.